At its very core, film is a medium that was created for and has prospered in its ability to entertain the audience. Sure, there are a plethora of reasons to go out of your way to watch a movie. I would hate for this video to be seen as undermining the emotional and intellectual core of cinema, as no matter what, the emotions and substance of a movie are always the base pillars of quality, and I believe this to be evident in this video and pretty much any essay I've made. However, when we're talking about what it is that brings and has brought the vast majority of people to watch a movie in a theater, and what it is that the film industry has banked on to keep it thriving for over a century now, it is this idea of going to experience something epic and otherworldly, to go see something that provides you a feeling you just can't get to the same extent anywhere else, but in that dark room, isolated from the outside world and engulfed in the story, the world, and the moments that create an experience you just don't get every day. In recent times, this void has been filled by the superhero genre and Marvel, and while its near monopolization of the film zeitgeist cannot be understated, these movies are still just a few in a very long line. And while some may confuse the idea of being a blockbuster film with being an epic, I stress that this is a false equivalency without implications working either way. A movie can be truly epic but not do so well at the box office, while it is rare to see since word of mouth can go so far. Simultaneously, a film can be a blockbuster hit but not necessarily be an epic, which leads me into our main question for today. What is it that makes a movie truly epic? When comparing what is critically considered an epic in the mediums of film and literature, I find the literary terminology much more potent when it comes to the argument I am making here. The film definition can be seen as much more ambiguous, at times referring to the scale and genre of a film, and at times falling into the false equivalency of blockbusters and epics, solely referring to the budget and success of a film. In literature, an epic is much more concretely defined as a long story about a hero that serves as an organizing point of cultural or social identity, and obviously the epic genre has a lot to do with the scale and ambitions of the artists within their respective mediums. In this sense, an epic is very generally a story that is about something so large that it speaks to grander themes of humanity and speaks to a deeper sensibility that smaller scale projects just can't. Now, with this broad understanding, let's get into the first plot element that makes an epic. Simply put, to be an epic, the setting of the story must have a sense of distance from the viewer. The story must be mythic in proportion, which is achieved by actually having the story be a fictional account of grandeur, often filmically in the sci-fi or fantasy genres, or having the film be about figures or times so grand in history that they feel mythic. Take what is the oldest known story in our history, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which teeters the line of both, as it is unknown whether Gilgamesh is a true historic figure, but either way, the story is one that explores a figure so grand in history or fantasy at a distant time. I will proclaim to the world the deeds of Gilgamesh. This was the man to whom all things were known. This was the king who knew the countries of the world. He was wise, he saw mysteries and knew secrets things. He brought us a tale of the days before the flood. He went on a long journey, was weary, worn out with labor. Returning, he rested. He engraved on a stone the whole story. In a time before the New World was known to be, and travel between nations was a far gone dream for many, Gilgamesh was painted as a king, a man whose story was set across the entire world, a man who experienced tribulations of mythic proportions, and this is the case for any epic story. By taking place in such broad, distant, and intricate settings and worlds, it is easier to insert characters who go on more substantive journeys that are often, as myths are at their core, all-encompassing metaphors for humanity as a whole in the struggles of man. Think of where a lot of the movies that you consider to be epics take place. They are often in the distant future or far past, or maybe just a time outside of our realm. Think of Arrakis, Tatooine, Middle Earth, ancient Greece, or Rome, and if they aren't set in these realms outside of our imaginations, they take place during times of huge historic significance. Think of one of the Great Wars, or a civil war, or even over many generations. Epics set themselves in times or places so grand that the audience wouldn't even be able to conjure the intricacies of these worlds in a simple memory. We are introduced to full-on settings that remind us of the intricacies of the very world that we live in, but are rarely able to take a step back and look upon. on. And how else is this done than through the very eyes of the second plot element we will focus on? So, now that we are plopped into this grand world, how else are we to experience this world other than through the eyes of the second plot element we will focus on, the characters of an epic? Now, the main protagonist of an epic is almost always the typical hero that is in one form or another following Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Often the best way to ease the audience into this grand setting is by establishing a clear good and evil. Of course, there should be in the best stories add a lot more intricacies to the world we are introduced to, but no matter what, an epic always presents us with a clear good we are following. Often to counterbalance the forefront intricacies of the setting, we are given a pretty straightforward protagonist to start off with. And as with any protagonist, our hero must be flawed. He must have things to overcome both internally and externally. Think about Ben-Hur and why he is the main character of the movie rather than Jesus Christ himself. But at the same time, while an epic does have to at the very least begin with a typical hero, that doesn't mean that it can't subvert the trope. Most recently, Dune Part 2 did exactly this in its ending. The Godfather Part 2 is a true epic that presents the downfall of what in the very first act of The Godfather Part 1 could have easily been mistaken as a typical hero character, which gets me into the final plot element, the plot itself, in the themes surrounding it. At the very root of an epic is a mythic or near mythic story that, just like the myths of old, either traces back our origins, looks far into what humanity could be, or looks at the heights of what humanity has reached, its most prescient moments to explain something about a grander experience and broader themes, to teach the audience a lesson about some of the most human topics that can be touched on. By presenting us with grand characters, a clear hero, a grand world and setting with clear rules as to what is right and what is wrong, and by depicting so many events, epics always attempt to and should succeed in getting across a very clear message through the ultimate victory or defeat of its main character. The Godfathers Part 1 and 2 attempt to get across tragic lessons about power, family, trust, and love through the tragic downfall of Michael Corleone and the simultaneous rise of his father Vito. Going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, it is a story about the king who tried to conquer death itself. A story filled with evil spirits, gods, goddesses, rivals, otherworldly creatures, famines, and events of biblical proportions, but at the end it is clear that death comes for everyone. So, plot-wise, these are the three primary elements that I have identified for a story to contain to be considered an epic. It must be set in an otherworldly space, either in time or place, or in the rarest of cases in power. An epic must present a world that a normal viewer just cannot usually enter than through the story itself. This is why I would consider The Godfathers to be epics, while I don't consider Goodfellas to. The Godfather trilogy is taking us into the top of a world, presented with a lot more glamour and pristineness than in Goodfellas, where we are just being taken through the life of a foot soldier in the gangster world. On top of the element, we must be presented with a typical hero, at least at the beginning of the narrative, with clear-cut good and evil forces throughout the story, all in order to present to the audience grand themes about humanity itself. Now that we have all the narrative elements that make an epic out of the way, we can get more into the bare bones of the filmic elements. What is it that makes watching an epic moment so much more riveting than reading it when done right? While some are quick to refer to epics as a genre within themselves, I am reluctant to do the same. To me, an epic is much more a style of narrative and filmmaking. Epics can take place within many different genres except for one. To be an epic, there needs to be a certain level of seriousness to a project. Sure, comedy and levity is necessary to an extent in any film, but to be an epic, there must be an overall sense of importance that accompanies the scale, and this is done through the dialogue. Obviously, the narrative plotting itself and many other elements can contribute to this momentousness. I think the cinematography and framing of a film is a close second in importance when it comes to making a momentous scene. The sound design and score of a movie have the most weight when it comes to emphasizing and elevating the epicness of a film and keeping the audience engaged and riveted in what we are watching. The score can make or break an epic moment or scene. The individual mediums of literature and music have the ability to create epics. So imagine the peaks of what can be created when both of these are brought together with precision. When I think of my favorite epics, I can visualize the moments that cemented them and the scores that accompanied them to create the experiences that I just cannot replicate outside of another epic film that does the same. For anybody that has seen Dune Part 2 in a theater by now, they know exactly the feeling I'm talking about. The booming score, accompanying introduction scenes or battle scenes or simple one-on-one fight scenes. While everything in that movie already had reached such high highs, the score elevates it to even further heights, as does the score for almost every movie that you can consider an epic. Much more simply, the length and pacing of a film are also highly important in what makes an epic. The word that I have used the most throughout this essay is grand, and that's not for no reason. In order for a film to reach the highs that an epic sets out to achieve, it has to be quite long. In fact, there aren't many movies that can be considered an epic that are less than 2 hours and 40 minutes long, and that itself is stretching it. I know that sounds kind of arbitrary, and it is, but just broadly thinking, a film needs time to do all of the things I talked about in the first half of this video. This grand world needs to be established, this almighty hero needs to be introduced, and we need to care about them. These all-encompassing themes need to be established, and we need to have a base understanding of how all this works in tandem. The rules of this humongous world, this story that we are about to experience, there is so much necessary to build up before the story itself can even get going. This is why I wouldn't consider just Dune Part 1 or just Dune Part 2 alone to be an epic. These are two individual parts to a much larger 5-hour long epic. Obviously, it is the important events of a movie that we remember as being the epic moments of a film, the parts that make it so great, but we need to build up to get there, and it is a direct relationship in my eyes. The greater the moment, the greater the build up, and while yes, quantity doesn't always necessitate quality, it is definitely not a deterrent to it. And in epic films, the quantity of time that we spend with the groups we are following and rooting for actually does often directly lead to the quality of the epic moments just being that much grander. And with that, we lead into the final state of an epic film, the imagery and moments. So after all this time with these characters and all of this build up, where are we now? The viewer has spent genuine time with this hero, has understood and has grown to love the people that the hero is associated with, and now comes the test. The moments where this grand story in this grand world where our hero has set out to do something unprecedented can easily come to a halt. Moments of progression or ultimate demise. And since we've been introduced and understand the distant world or time, we understand its rules, we know who the good is and who they are fighting, and the stakes are so high that the success or failure of this moment will lead to the success or failure of an entire family, an entire generation, an entire nation, an entire people, or maybe even the entire world. We are invested in this moment, on the edge of our seats, awaiting the result, completely engrossed in this moment. The story transcends the visual, oral, and reaches out to the physical. I mean, it's said that the very first time somebody fully translated and understood the epic of Gilgamesh, they were so blown away that they stripped down to nothing. And here we sit watching another epic, one of the descendants of Gilgamesh, with the booming score surrounding you and rattling your seat, sending chills down your spine as you can only just sit there and be blown away by its mastery.